So currently I'm in the beginning of the second year of my PhD project on the Danish Climate Citizens Assembly. And the PhD project is supervised by Professor Lars Tønder. And here in Australia, I'm visiting Professor David Schlotsberg at Sydney Environment Institute at University of Sydney. And he's the one who recommended me to come here and visit you in Canberra. But in today's presentation, I will focus primarily on the content of the second chapter of my monograph. I've made some adjustments to ensure that it resonates with the topic of the research seminar series on democratic futures. And maybe more correctly, what I will be talking about is some of the challenges facing us in democratic futures. So I just wanted to say or flag that my work, which I'm presenting today, is still a work in progress. So all comments, feedback, or pushback are really appreciated. But before I kind of get ahead of myself, I really wanted to give you guys some context of the Danish or about the Danish Climate Citizens Assembly. And so this is a map of mapping like where the different citizens from the Climate Citizens Assembly came from in Denmark. And the Danish Citizens Assembly is a government-sponsored national mini-public, which draws inspiration from primarily France, the UK, and Ireland. And the assembly consisted of 99 randomly selected citizens. The extent of power and influence was primarily advisory and consultative, with the scope of offering recommendations to government on how to reach the Danish 70% reduction goal. The assembly was planned in 2 phases, and the citizens had large autonomy in deciding the agenda of the final recommendations, and to some extent also the relevant experts. The first phase was due to the pandemic online, while the second phase consisted of 4 online expert meetings and 2 weekends with deliberations. So originally it was proposed that the assembly would feed into a specific policy process, but when the corona pandemic erupted in the beginning of 2020, the Danish government postponed the assembly and changed the ambitions of the assembly. Among other things, I think this created some misunderstandings and blurry lines around the transmission between the Climate Citizens Assembly and the government. So how the recommendations was received is not really relevant for today's presentation, but if you're interested, I'm currently co-authoring a paper on this with my supervisor and colleague, Lars Tønder and Frederik Langkjær. But today I will mostly be talking about some of the give you some background on my PhD monograph and the research project it is embedded in. So my research project, or as a PhD fellow, I'm a member of a larger research project called Democratic Innovations in the Green Transition. And the overall purpose of this research project is to consider first how the assembly strengthens support for the green transition policies, and second, to what extent it produces more progressive climate change policies. We approach these questions by looking at civil society and formal political institutions to consider how they interact with the Danish Climate Citizens Assembly. So you can see this model which illustrates this. However, my project, it focused primarily on the Danish Climate Citizens Assembly, and from the beginning of the PhD, I've been able to follow the meetings in the first phase and later also the second phase of the Climate Citizens Assembly. Because the first phase was online, we had unique access to the meetings of the assembly. And when the format then was changed to a more hybrid format, in the second phase, we still had access to all of the meetings. Thus, I was able to join all the meetings on Zoom or physically, and quite literally be a fly on the wall, witnessing the citizens' deliberations. After both the first and second phase, I interviewed a subset of the citizens participating in the assembly and the organizers of the assembly. So about like 1/3 of the members from the first phase continued in the second phase. I also had the opportunity to interview some of the members twice and get their views on the comparativeness of these two phases. Okay, so these interviews with the citizens, they also became the foundation for the title of my PhD project, which I for the moment call Democratic Lingering. So the title of democratic lingering is meant to capture the ambiguity of democratic futures. Lingering is an adjective which hints to something that remains, survives, persists, but also have a nagging sense to it. I would argue that democracy is always in a lingering state. We never fully understand how long it will last, and we, as political theorists, always fear it has already come to an end. So with this monograph, I want to argue that the Climate Citizens Assembly, it illustrates the state of democratic lingering. In a Danish context, many have been quick to judge it as a failure because neither the government nor parliament took the recommendations from the citizens seriously. However, when we look at the broader context, civil society is still demanding a new Climate Citizens Assembly with a stronger mandate. And climate assemblies are bursting out in Denmark on a more local level now. I hope to understand how we can negotiate a more democratic future from this state of ambiguity and lingering. Yeah. So what I will present today is something from chapter 2, or some of the arguments from chapter 2 around democratic innovations. And what I aim to do with this chapter is to map the academic roots of climate citizens assemblies to better understand the current deliberative wave in Europe. So the political theorist Helen Landemore begins her recent book, Open Democracy, with the statement, a deliberative wave of democratic innovations have washed over the Western world in the last 10 years. So the idea of democratic innovations encompass, in the words of Graham Smith, institutions specifically designed to increase and deepen citizens' participation in political decision-making. And citizens' assemblies thus falls under this umbrella of democratic innovations. So, as documented by others, democratic innovations is currently on the search academically, but also practically. For instance, the Knowledge Network on Climate Assemblies have gathered information on 10 national climate assemblies organized within the last 5 years. And the tendency is clear that across Europe, governments are appointing citizens to lead the way towards a green transition. So these initiatives, they are introduced as solutions to some of the most fundamental challenges facing democracy. And the concept is imbued with a desire to reimagine what we think we know about democracy. And it carries with it a promise that a different democracy is possible. Thus, when we look at the core concept of democratic innovations and climate citizens assemblies more specifically, it addresses the multiple challenges encountering democracy in its current condition. So my question is then, what are these challenges? Because ingrained in the concept of democratic innovation, the assumption is that something needs to be different. But from the different definitions of democratic innovations, we can understand that it's the role of the citizens which requires renegotiation. But when we zoom in on Climate Citizens Assembly, I would argue that particular three movements are challenging the role of the citizens. I'll just show you here. So these are neoliberalism, the crisis of representative democracy, and finally, the ecological and climate crisis. While the two first challenges are pretty well described in the literature on democratic innovations, the third one seems to be slightly neglected. Overwhelmingly in the sparse literature on climate citizens' assemblies, climate change is described as an occasion for governments to include citizens. What I propose is that we need to take serious that the climate and ecological crisis, it challenges the role of the citizens in a particular way, which appears to have enabled mobilization around climate citizens' assemblies in unprecedented ways. So if we zoom in on each of these challenges, it allows us to understand the different ways in which the role of the citizens in democracy is challenged and how climate citizens' assemblies are enabling this new role. Okay, so I'll just go through each challenge. And if we start with neoliberalism, political theorist Wendy Brown argues in her book Undoing the Demos that contemporary democratic institutions are hollowed out from within by neoliberal rationality. This includes the political culture required to nourish and animate democratic life and citizens' participation. Neoliberalism economized political life, reducing it to the principles of the market, and where citizens would exercise political rights through general elections, and where accountability of those elected is exercised through competitive elections. In Brown's more recent work, she argues that neoliberalism pursued this strategy of political pacifying citizens to avoid the irrationality of the political in democracy and sovereignty, thus centralizing political power in the hands of those elected to ensure that an ignorant, aroused citizenry would not mobilize politically. And I'm actually not so sure whether this is mostly relevant in the context of the Danish Climate Citizens Assembly, but the book title here in Danish is a book from Denmark called Taming the Elite, and the idea, at least in Denmark, of citizens' assemblies was actually largely produced with or kind of proposed from sociologists working on power relations and how kind of we would figure out how to counter the problem with that power in Denmark had been too centralized in a certain elite. So in Denmark, these two narratives are very close. But then when we move to the second challenge for democracy, I would argue that it's to a larger extent a more conceptual and institutional challenge. So in many ways, the problem is the same as the previous challenge, namely that the role of the citizens' participation is reduced to elections. However, this critique is often combined with a commitment to the political imaginative of a deliberative democracy, which I guess all of you is very familiar with, but which assumes that two tracks of powers, the communicative, or some would say the public, and the administrative power. And the two-track model, it suggests slow, rigid, and mechanical communicative exchanges between these two tracks. So deliberative Democrats such as Landemore and others argues that what is underdeveloped or malfunctioning in current representative democracy is how to ensure the transmission, filtering, and processing of information between the two tracks. This current system of representative democracy fails to ensure this communication between the two tracks, but also to cultivate deliberations in public. So climate citizens' assemblies, they are often produced as a supplementary or proposed as a supplementary institution to representative government. And also they are proposed to ensure sound deliberations in the public and transmission between the administrative and the public system. And now I arrive at the third challenge, which is the ecological and climate crisis. And I would argue that this last challenge, it's a bit different than the previous ones, because the climate and ecological crisis, it's caused by human-induced climate change, and many have argued that it is more material and visceral in the way the effects of climate change is felt by the public in changing weathers, rising sea levels, bushfires, etc. Furthermore, the last couple of years is also testament to the extent of which political mobilization is possible around this issue. So activists are more than ever, at least in a Danish context, taking the streets to demand ambitious political actions. And in the Danish context, also civil society organizations was fundamental in creating the necessary pressure for establishing a national climate citizens assemblies through demonstrations. In this perspective, citizens are assumed to be more prone to suggesting ambitious In this perspective, citizens are assumed to be more prone to suggesting more ambitious green transition policies because they don't have to rely on elections. So this is kind of my mapping of the challenges which leads us to suggest climate citizens assemblies, or this is how we kind of got climate citizens assemblies. So what I have hoped to illustrate is that these three challenges, they pose different democratic imaginaries that all points towards climate citizens assemblies. So my question is then whether current attempts of institutionalizing climate citizens assemblies, and here of course I'm thinking specifically of the Danish one, but maybe we can talk about it in a broader context, is capable of responding to each challenge equally, and whether we as researchers evaluate, understand, and judge climate citizens assemblies according to each crisis. My argument is that we are focused perhaps a bit too much on the crisis in representative government and neoliberalism, but that we forgot to significantly understand how and why ecological and climate crisis is creating a demand for political mobilization around the idea of institutionalizing citizens' assemblies. So in political science, the study of citizens' assemblies, mini-publics or democratic innovations have traditionally focused on opinion formation, institutions, and deliberative democratic theory. And what I want to suggest is that if we want to emphasize the climate and ecological crisis in our analysis, we maybe have to change the focus of our research on climate citizens assemblies significantly. Yeah, so what I want to argue is that we need to move this discussion around climate citizens assemblies into the context of the Anthropocene. And I know that some people at this sense have already done some work moving towards this. But we need to do this to pay attention to the multitude of challenges which climate citizens assemblies are supposed to solve. This is something which I recognized from my fieldwork and interviews with the citizens, where they told me that participating in this assembly to a large extent was an experience full of perplexity. Therefore, we need to employ theories open to these complexities and contradictions constantly arising during the assembly. And the assembly is just neither solely about contesting neoliberal rationality, ensuring a deliberative public, nor proposing better policies towards green transition. It is about all of the above, all at once. So approaching the climate citizens assemblies through the lens of the Anthropocene, and also one might say the planetary, allows us to explore the multitude of challenges. It also allows us to position the analysis of the Danish Climate Citizens Assembly somewhere where we can admit that the assembly is a product of multiple overlapping crises unfolding all at once. So we need to do better in recognizing the fragility of these processes and be better at exploring the possibilities they entail. To conclude, what I want to suggest with this presentation is that Climate Citizens Assembly, or at least in the Danish case, it didn't emerge out of nowhere. It came from multiple different approaches with a multitude of different expectations attached to it. And I fear that if we fail to understand the assembly adequately with And no, I fear that we fail to understand the assembly adequately without a thorough understanding of the multiple layers of meanings entangled in the design of and expectations to climate citizens assemblies.